Hello, and welcome to the first T2RL Talks of 2026. Who knew we'd all live this long? For once in a while, we're going to raise our heads a little bit from our usual subject matter, and we're not going to be looking at the detail of technology or distribution, but we're going to be taking a wider look at the state of the airline industry as we finish 2025 and move into 2026. Obviously, the overall state of the industry has an impact on what airlines need to be doing with their technology and with their distribution channels. So we will eventually circle back round to our usual territory. But to have the conversation with me, once again, I've got Bert Craven, head of our technology practice and deputy CEO at T2RL. I've got Ian Luck, who is head of our distribution practice, and our not that new anymore head of research, Amanda Campbell, who are joining me in the studio in this second week of January 2026.
Happy New Year to all our listeners.
Absolutely. So we published last week our annual review of the state of the airline industry and tried to draw out from that some implications for our areas of technology and distribution. So we're going to have a little bit of a conversation today about some of the things that were in that. And probably anyone looking at the state of the world today, never mind the airline industry, would be struck by the fact that there seem to be an awful lot of wars going on. And I just did check this online, and according to a reliable source, there are something between 100 and 130 armed conflicts going on in the world right now. And prior to 2020, that number would have been about 50. So the world is becoming more volatile, and obviously that has an impact on airlines, whether it's in closure of airspace or sanctions or actual physical threats to airlines. What do we think about that? Do we feel from our perspective that the world is becoming a more violent place? Anyone would like to take that on? Bert.
Well, if there are more wars going on, then yes, because unless people are all standing still doing nothing in these wars, I'm assuming they involve violence. And I think it's also, there's just general sense of unpredictability and a lack of stability, not just from the far-flung corners of the world where, you know, if a local conflict started, you know, there would be a sort of collective eye roll and go, well, they've been fighting on and off for years, but also from the big players in the world, just new battle lines being drawn, unusual stances, shifts in allegiance. You know, we've seen changes in American foreign policy, you know, and you know, the latest American foreign policy really doesn't talk about America's traditional enemies, you know, America and China very much at all, you know, or North Korea. You know, it talks about, you know, Europe, and America now seems to have an avowed policy of supporting nationalist movements in Europe. And so I think that whole kind of shift in what has been probably a roughly prevailing similar direction of foreign policy from big players since the end of the Cold War, at least, if not before, does feel like it has significantly shifted. And it's not that, you know, Ukraine and various other conflicts notwithstanding, it's not that there are wars going on, it's just that you're really not sure where the next one is going to happen and what battle line it will be over.
Yeah, and I certainly don't want to belittle the impact of armed conflicts, because clearly they are horrendous if you happen to be immediately caught up in it. But the knock-on effects for an industry like ours that is really about global communication and global movement is really quite significant. Ian, before we started the recording, we were talking about some of the knock-ons that might occur in terms of changes to visa requirements, security arrangements, the ability to route flights the most economical way. A lot of that stuff goes on that really airline executives need to be taken into account.
Absolutely. I mean, obviously, the Ukraine situation was very, well known to many people, and we saw some airlines like Finnair having to kind of redraw their whole network, given their dependence on Russian airspace. And we see that the flights from China to Europe now are much more provided by Chinese airlines than European airlines, because they can overfly Russia and the European airlines can't. There's probably lots of smaller issues that are also impact airlines beyond those kind of headline issues that we see with a major conflict. We also had technology impacts, of course, from the Ukraine situation, with Russian airlines stopping using Sabre and Amadeus and Western tech providers and switching. So there's lots of impacts, probably many of which we don't even follow at a high level.
Yeah, some weird things like jamming of GPS in certain airspaces, all sorts of stuff that we've got to the point where we almost take for granted. Now everyone's got a GPS on their phone now, and yet sort of global systems like that are being disrupted in a global way by relatively quite small players. But I mean, we've had some very arbitrary things. The Venezuelan airspace just being declared closed, and threats being hurled at Cuba, which could result in closure of airspace over the Caribbean, all kinds of things. I think it just goes back to that. It's not necessarily what is happening. It's just what you feel like could happen at any minute.
Yeah, and it means that airline executives who are involved with planning and managing situations day to day really can't afford to relax. Anytime, we used to talk about busy times and quiet times. I don't think there are any quiet times anymore.
One of the things I think we often see if you read the kind of investor reports that airlines publish around their results, many airlines talk about having flexibility in things like fleet orders and network size and things like that, because I think it is definitely the case that people are sort of looking ahead and thinking, do we know what will happen to demand over the next 5 to 10 years? And it's much harder to predict than perhaps it was in the past.
I mean, demand notoriously highly stochastic and affected by all kinds of factors, but the supply side as well, in terms of airspace closures, it does feel like up to maybe the end of last year, middle of last year, the industry had quietly absorbed the closure of Ukrainian airspace and instability in the Middle East and a few other things. But it's getting to the point now where you're thinking, well, what's going to be the straw that breaks the camel's back there?
Yeah, and yet our initial look, and we'll be publishing a much more detailed report on this a little way into the year, but our initial look suggests that actual business in terms of demand and passengers boarded through the year continued on its post-COVID recovery. Amanda, you've been working with the research team in Mumbai on this. We're not yet seeing any great impact on the airline industry's business from the uncertainty that we're talking about.
Yeah, just from what we've been seeing, demand continues to be high. We haven't seen any impact from the geopolitical situations, the economic situations that have been sort of impacting the world. I guess what we have, what's sort of on my radar, I guess, in terms of impact is maybe some of the downstream things like the price of fuel. These are the supply side constraints. Like if fuel lines are disrupted, if access to fuel is compromised in any way, that's going to be an issue. Maybe if there's a war on, then it means that equipment is less available as well. So demand might be there, but then, is the supply side able to keep up? And then in addition, I guess that consumers are hugely price sensitive. So any uptick in price is going to have an effect. I don't think I agree with Bert. It's just a matter of like what's going to tip us over the edge in terms of a different look at how demand is playing out and how pricing is playing out over the next year.
Okay, I'd like to pick up on something you just said about fuel price, because something quite interesting is going on. Conventional fuel prices are relatively low. We've seen, a great deal of fluctuation over the last few years with the pandemic, and then the war in Ukraine sent fuel conventional fuel prices in all sorts of different directions, but they've kind of stabilized. What hasn't eased yet is the cost of sustainable aviation fuel, for which there are government mandates and multinational mandates that airlines need to be increasing their use of SAF, and we're still well under 1% of the fuel requirement being SAF. And one of the things that we observed last year was the COP30 climate conference, which, as far as I could see, achieved almost nothing. It was a great disappointment.
But I mean, almost backward movement in some places. Yeah.
Well, I mean, absolutely backward movement in terms of some of the big players who just decided not to play. They did not participate and have no intention of participating in the immediate future. But what that means is that, firstly, the aviation industry, which is not a huge contributor to climate change on the scale of agriculture or even surface shipping,
fashion,
but nevertheless is highly visible, and as a result is always going to be a target for attempts to mitigate climate change. And certainly we've seen IATA in the person of Willie Walsh popping up in all kinds of places around the world to really lobby governments to ease up on the airline industry. I'm not sure that's going to actually happen, given the visibility of our industry.
No, I think there's partly the visibility. There's also this continued prevailing sense that somehow air transport in general is a discretionary luxury, as opposed to an infrastructural need like construction or farming or something like that. And I think the airline industry has always suffered from that view that somehow it's just rich people bashing off on holiday kind of thing. So it's always felt like a soft target for people to go after, and a bit unfairly, but it is what it is. I mean, it's very difficult to change people's perception of the usefulness of the contribution.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing there is, of course, historically, air travel was for rich people. And one of the big changes we've seen during this century is the rise of low-cost airlines to make air travel available to sort of middle-income people. There are still very many very poor people in the world who never see the inside of an airplane, but certainly it has become a mainstream facility for the middle classes. And you look at an airline like Indigo in India that has risen from, almost nowhere to being the biggest airline in that country and doing 100 million passengers. And those are what we would usually call middle class people rather than very wealthy people who are using that. So I think that socially and from a policy perspective, certainly in the democratic world, I don't see how the growth of the airline industry can be curtailed by policy. I think we really are. It is incumbent on us to try and manage that growth in a sustainable way.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think it should be curtailed in any real sense. It needs to be managed sustainably. But if you look at the long tail contribution to economics of air transport and travel and tourism and cargo and all of the things that go with it, there are trillions and trillions of dollars tied up in it. And there's a huge long tail of industries, not just tourism, but all other things that kind of rely on it to a great degree. And then there are some entire economies that would be, basically booted back to almost Stone Age level if air travel stopped.
So I think what we're saying is that we're not expecting to see a significant contraction in the industry. So any plans that airlines have for managing growth really need to stay in place, albeit in a very flexible manner.
No, and I mean, as I said, I think demand is quite unpredictable. It's stochastic and it's affected by a lot of things. But I am quite, bullish about demand. It does keep surprising us, and surprising us in new ways. And I think I was trying to think the other day, because we had this kind of big bump, this bubble after COVID of finally travel again. And I wonder if there's an element of travel while you can. People are sort of anticipating some dim disaster in the future that they can't quite make out. Is it going to be another stock market crash or another war or something?
Maybe even subconsciously.
Yes, really.
Yeah.
We might not be able to afford it next year, folks. Let's go while we can, kind of thing. But no, demand continues to surprise us and is unpredictable, but so far been pretty buoyant.
Yeah. So let's talk about one of the factors that will drive demand or possibly drive a reduction in demand, and that is just the overall state of the economy as measured by the stock market. And what seems to be happening is that, just like in the sort of general economy of individuals, the stock market is concentrating around a very small number of extremely large firms, and they're all firms that are concerned with technology, and specifically with AI technologies.
Yeah, well, certainly in the US, this is true. But then again, you look at the UK, the FTSE had its highest day in its recorded history or something last week or the week before. So yes, there are some concentrations, but there are other factors buoying up the markets at the moment that I don't think we can just point the finger at AI and tech and go, well, it's that. There is other stuff going on here.
Well, except that, do you remember in 2018, Apple became the first ever company with a market capitalization of $1 trillion?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was August 2018. I looked it up before we started. Now there are something of the order of 10 companies with market caps of over $1 trillion.
Yeah.
And the biggest four are all up around the $4 trillion mark.
Yeah. I mean,
and that's in 7 years.
Yeah. And there's no question that there are some absurd bubbles out there, and what we have is basically too much capital chasing too little growth, and it's sort of symptomatic late stage capitalism. There isn't enough growth to support. We've become so polarized. There's so much money sloshing around chasing growth, and we're not happy with little growth anymore. We have to have things like Bitcoin, which quadruples in value overnight, and unicorns that go from no value, no revenue, certainly zero profit, but yet have multi-billion-dollar valuations. And there's an awful lot of that kind of sloshing around, which is where I think some of these crazy valuations come from. But it's very difficult to tie them all back to one thing at the other end of the market. I think there's kind of wishful investing in some cases. There is just too many people trying to make money out of capital rather than trying to make money out of real stuff.
Yeah, and I guess the big question really is: are we heading towards a correction, and or is this growth going to continue for the long term? I don't want to put a number on it.
A lot of voices say yes, that there must be a market correction. The question at the moment is how big and when. Because I don't think there's anyone.
Do we have to state that we don't offer financial advice, and we're not?
No, we absolutely don't offer any financial advice, and we probably don't really know what we're talking about in real terms. But from the we all read and we all follow these things as closely as we can. And I don't think there's anyone who'd say that the market currently is normal or right or sensible or anything like that. It's really a question of how big is the correction going to be, and when is it going to come, and kind of who is going to blink first. It's like, there have been a lot of people saying that basically the music has already stopped in the US. Nobody wants to be the first one to admit it.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of our industry again, because keep on focusing on our industry. Look back to 2008 when there was a major market correction around the world, and at that time, the airlines rode it out relatively successful. The the impression I had at the time, and it was in the early days of T2RL, and we were just starting to follow these things. But the previous couple of years, the price of fuel had gone through the roof. Mm-hmm. And that seemed to impact the airlines way more than a stock market.
Yeah.
I'm going to use the word crash that happened in 2008. So to an extent, I think the airline industry is somewhat immune, not completely immune because nothing ever is, but somewhat immune.
I think it's a little bit different. It's immune from what? You get crashes that mainly affect kind of big financial players and financial mechanisms, and the bottom falls out of the subprime mortgages market and so on. The effects on people's ability to spend, their willingness to go on holiday, the effects on businesses' willingness to travel to do business are less affected there. But I think we also have this not global but fairly serious cost of living crisis as well, where people's ability and willingness to spend is, it's not at breaking point, but it wouldn't take much for it to start affecting the holy cows of the family budget, which is, things like the family holiday. And one of the things that we learned in 2008 is that, people will downgrade. They will fly on a low-cost carrier to their holiday and stay in a slightly worse hotel and so on, and they'll eat tuna for a week and tighten their belt, but they will not cancel the annual family holiday. Things have to get very tight in a kind of tax and spend sense before that happens. But I think the question is, how close are we to that, given that there's a general acknowledgement with fuel prices, heating prices, food prices, which have all been creeping up steadily for the last 4 or 5 years, there isn't much cushion to absorb a big economic shock at the moment.
See, I'm not an economist by any means, but I'm under the impression that it's consumer confidence more than even like discretionary spend is probably more of a sign of, is demand going to be there, or are people going to spend on, that family holiday? Okay, maybe they are going to spend on the family holiday and they're going to eat tuna, but it's what's going on in their brain more so than actually what's in their pocket. And then certainly with what Ian was saying at the start, the conflict, the uncertainty and so forth, that it has to come a time where Mary on the street is going to go, whoa, this is way too scary for me. I'm just going to hunker down for a year. We might not see any sort of impact from that for a little while. I mean, maybe there's going to be a lag there.
And that is the interesting thing, is that's what, that cushion element is, how quickly does it hit the pocket of Mary on the street when there's a big shock in the American stock market or something?
Yeah.
There are a lot of shock absorbers within the system, and it's just a question of how stretched are we when the shock comes.
Yeah. I mean, as you said, Bert, demand goes up and down. Our industry does respond to that. I think I remember BA, when I was there in 2008, hit double-digit margins for the first time in record profits. In 2009, didn't make any money at all. BA was probably more dependent on corporate traffic and banks and so on, so perhaps worse hit than some. But it was only a year or two before there was quite a big recovery again.
Yeah.
So I guess some of these things, at some point the graph turns downward, but it does tend to kind of go down the roller coaster and back up the other side quite quickly.
I am pretty sure that EasyJet got some of your money that year. I mean, that will have been the way it worked.
I'm glad I could help.
Yeah. Okay, let's look at the other side of this coin then. This huge valuations in the stock market is largely from companies involved in AI, and if those valuations are ever going to be even remotely justified, AI is going to have to impact pretty much every area of commercial life. And we're already seeing a lot of talk about how it's going to impact our industry. And Ian, the hot topic now is agentic AI, and are we all going to be using software agents to book our travel, and what is going to be the impact on airline systems? And I did see that Claude Muller, our friend at IATA, published a very long think piece on his blog this week about an architecture for AI in our industry. Let's just kick that sort of thought around for a little bit. What are going to be the impacts of AI, assuming it's going to be as all pervasive as it needs to be?
I mean, within our industry, there's lots of aspects. I mean, I don't think anybody knows fully the answer to that question. If they did, they'd probably be making a lot of money somewhere. We do. I mean, it's clear that lots of people are looking at how AI can help with back office processes, with operational activities in airports, in all kinds of things like that. On the commercial side, I think it's a little bit hard to predict. We would certainly encourage people to be thinking about this and looking at it. Burying your head in the sand is not a good idea. We see our friends at Turkish Technology have published their MCP servers. That one of the first airlines to do that. That's a very interesting move, and there's quite a lot of information publicly available that's worth a look at if you're interested in what somebody's doing. It feels a little early for people to be kind of saying this is going to radically change things, but as always, we do encourage people to be thinking ahead, thinking about, well, what could change over the next year, 2 years, 3 years? What if I'm signing a new contract, whether that's a distribution contract or a modern airline retailing OSD contract? Am I at least thinking about preserving some flexibility, protecting myself if things do change, even if perhaps we don't really know exactly yet what's going to come? And there are certainly some people who think this is going to completely change our industry. There are other people who think this is sort of, I don't know, the new version of Google search and the new version of meta search. It's a new way in, and it isn't much more than that. And there's all kinds of views in the middle. And so I don't think we like to sort of say this is definitely what's going to happen when we understand that it's a varying environment. But thinking about it and preparing for it and being kind of ready contractually and from a technology point of view is sensible.
Yeah, definitely.
So Bert, should every airline be implementing an MCP server this year?
No, I don't think so. I mean, if we look at the sort of the macro level and the long term, somebody had worked out based on the current rate of investment that the big AI companies are going to have to deliver $3 trillion worth of services by 2030 just to break even. Now that market just doesn't exist. But I mean, let's put that aside and imagine that the long-term economics of this are somehow going to be magically solved. I think it's early. It's very early days yet in this. I mean, there's this constant drum being beaten that that everything's being turned upside down and revolutionized, and you've got to jump on the latest bandwagon and get your bucket of the latest magic pixie dust to sprinkle on your technology, and you've got to do it now, otherwise you'll be made irrelevant tomorrow. I don't think that that's true. I think it's going to go at a sensible pace, and the rate of adoption will be slower, and the eventual actual use cases will be a fraction of the ones that are being touted. And I also think we're going to see some specializations beyond what exists today. So we have MCP today, which is a very general model for an AI to interact with a system. And the main advantage of it being that an AI can use MCP to effectively discover the schema and messages and functions that the system exposes without a developer having to explicitly build an integration and orchestrate that integration. The AI can do that. It can work that out for itself. That doesn't mean that API doesn't need good governance around it. It doesn't mean that it can operate without a contract and without security and without constraints and without a fair use policy and without all of the other things that we know every single other API that has ever existed needed, nor will it be magically excluded from things like parity agreements that you have in distribution and so on. So to that extent, as you hinted at, Ian, MCP is just another API, and you just have to look at it and say, well, who is it for and what can or should it do? And just take a sort of a rational and sensible view of that. But what we've also seen in the last couple of weeks is we've seen some more specialized protocols, if you like, appear. So Google have released UCP, I think it's called, which is Universal Commerce Protocol, which is kind of like MCP, except it's specifically to do with shopping and buying and checking out and so on. And a huge number of big retailers in the US have signed up to this UCP standard and have agreed that they will implement it on the basis that it will allow a consumer to complete a transaction and check out anywhere, in any app, on any surface, whatever they like. And there's been another one called UTCP, Universal Tool Calling Protocol, because a huge number of things that AI agents do are really simple things like check the weather and get flight status, which maybe don't need a big heavyweight transactional API, but they do need to be navigable and orchestratable by AIs. So, for all we know, by this time next year, there could be a universal travel commerce protocol, right? Which takes us from a universal commerce protocol to a universal travel commerce protocol that is specifically to do with the booking and management of inventories. Because we know historically, if we look how technology evolves, our history is littered with technology companies who thought they could take general commerce solutions and turn them into travel commerce solutions and failed miserably, ultimately. And so, why would it not also be true that a general MCP or UCP might not actually be ideal for the selling and managing of travel products, and we get more specialization. So there could be an IATA-backed and developed universal travel commerce protocol by next year. So the question is, do I jump now and implement an MCP and then have to do all of the work to try and make travel work through MCP, or do I wait a bit and see if something more specialized appears, or if one of my vendor partners develops a more specialized appliance? And look, if you're an airline out there and you have some spare cycles and some spare cash to spend, and you fancy having a bit of a fanfare, by all means, go ahead and implement an MCP server. I mean, you've got to be really clear what you're going to do with it, who it's for. But there will be lots of people who just chase shiny like they always have.
Yeah, I'm really interested, and this follows on from a conversation we actually had earlier today that we didn't record, but the idea that we will have some sort of specialized version of MCP or one of the other protocols specifically for travel or specifically for the airline industry. On the one hand, that goes against a lot of the propaganda from the last couple of years that airlines are going to move more into the mainstream and use general commerce products. On the other hand, in my view, it's pragmatic and realistic, and based on the experience of the last 80 years, it is likely that we'll go in that direction.
Yeah. And look, I mean, we can move more into the mainstream, and that's great. And we should work out ways that we can simplify and become more standardized and so on. But there are some fundamental things like, you just don't buy trainers 250 days before you're going to need them. Travel products are not like other products. And we can say, well, they're not important differences and AI will work it all out for us. That feels like a big bet for something that, just comes up with the most startling misunderstandings and errors on a daily basis at the moment.
Yeah, and it would be pretty rare to buy the left trainer from one company and the right trainer from another.
That's right, and not know the price of the left trainer until you've ordered the right one.
Yeah, which I guess brings us around in the usual full circle to really, it would be lovely if the industry could genuinely simplify some of its processes. But as long as those processes are out there and are complex, then the technology is going to have to accommodate that. Okay, there's one other area that I was just going to touch on before we got it deep into AI, and that is the supply side. We've talked about demand and how demand has held up, but on the supply side, the two mega manufacturers of passenger aircraft seem to be having trouble meeting their delivery expectations. Probably, I don't think it's too controversial to say Boeing is having it a little bit harder than Airbus, but Airbus too has had its issues, especially with engine supply and other things, which means that airlines are probably going to have to keep their network planning under constant review, because if they're planning their network on the basis that they're going to get a whole new fleet of new fuel efficient modern aircraft, and actually that's now not going to happen for another 5 years, that's a problem. And again, it brings us back to the question of flexibility, and probably, to my mind, the biggest single virtue in technology provision now for airlines is the ability to be flexible and to respond to the bumps in the road that are being thrown up.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of airlines over the last 5 years, even beyond, have learned a lot about flexibility. COVID taught, and the recovery from COVID taught airlines a lot about flexibility. The issues with Boeing and Airbus, and also engines. We should not forget that that's grounded a lot of airplanes. The engine issues that airlines have had as well. So there's been a lot of airlines who have got quite a different number of airplanes flying than they probably expected at different times, and that has impacted pricing and impacted network size, launch of routes. If you've got different numbers of airplanes, you have a different network and different schedules and so on. So there's a lot of impacts that airlines have had, and you need the technology to be able to make changes fairly quickly.
I noticed nobody's suggesting that airlines implement their AI fleet manager MCP server at this point.
It'll come. It will come. Yeah, I mean, circling back to AI yet again, several years ago, we published a paper about blockchain, and we said blockchain was largely a solution looking for some problems. And I think there's still some of that around AI these days. Yes. Yeah. Only with the stakes doubled or tripled or multiplied by a factor of 10, in terms of the investments that have gone into it. So we've kicked around a few issues. They're all there in our report that we published last week. If people want to pick up on it and have a look in a slightly more organized way at some of our thoughts. Just generally then, looking forward, we're at the beginning of 2026. What's your feeling for the way the industry is going to go this year? Is it going to be a good year? Is it going to be an even more challenging year? What are we going to be talking about when we come together this time next year? Any thoughts? Amanda, you start.
Yeah, well, I mean, it is challenging when you think about like all of the different things that we've got, sort of like the headwinds, so to speak. But like Ian Luck's right. I mean, if we can survive through COVID, we can survive through anything. And we've just learned to be so much more agile and flexible, and I think, we can just roll with it.
I think it's a bit unfair, really. You've spent 40 minutes telling us about all the things that make things incredibly unpredictable, and then asked us to make a prediction.
Yeah, but you're the president of distribution. You should know these things.
And you can be hopeful. I mean, I hope that we're looking at some of the things that all of the investments that we've been making have achieved. I mean, I do think that some useful things are going to come out of all of the investment that's been made in AI. I don't think it's going to be as big as people expect, and I don't think it's going to be necessarily where people think. But the point is, when the floodwaters subside and we start picking through the driftwood and the sort of, not the wreckage, but whatever's left behind, huge advances have been made in technology and understandings of certain, whether it's mathematical algorithms or models or whatever. And in the race to build the next bigger, better, a huge number of things have been developed and then immediately discarded because there's been an inexhaustible supply of money to build the next bigger one. And so a lot of things that have come up during this have remained unoptimized and really unexploited. And I think there will be some real sort of gold amongst the stuff that's left behind. I hope that we're looking at some really beneficial and surprising use cases for some of the technology that's been developed. And I'm also really hoping that we're talking about actual delivered benefits of OOSD. I mean, we said this at our conference last year that this has got to be the year of some of the benefits starting to come in. And so those are the things that I'm hoping that we're talking about, and also that we're not sitting here fretting about aircraft supply or global politics or wars or any of those other things.
There will always be global politics. What the nature will be nice global politics. Yes, that would be lovely. It's an interesting point, really, because I think every major technological upswelling, or whatever term we want to use, has had side effects that in some cases have gone on to be, you know, more significant than we thought the original project was. And that applies to things like, you know, the technology that came out of the Second World War, the technology that came out of the US space program, the technology that's coming out of now the race for AI. I read an interesting article the other day about what you might do with slightly second-hand GPUs and some of the applications for those, because there are going to be a lot of those lying around, given that GPUs become obsolete in about 18 months. And so, you know, there's going to be a lot of nearly new GPUs in the market. That
there may well be a lot of very cheap RAM, cheap infrastructure, empty data centers. We could move most of the world's sporting events indoors at this rate.
So,
just one more point as well. I mean, that there's the human side as well. So, you know, I think that AI, particularly generative and of course agentic, it's democratizing information. And it's allowing non-technical users to sort of access and query and make sense of large quantities of data. And I think that that's brilliant, because it means like people not like me, but, you know, that are curious can actually find the tools to find out stuff and create stuff. Now, I know that, it's probably got sort of vibes of vibe coding, and I don't mean that to that extent, but it does kind of, I think, give a certain part of the population new tools to be able to think and to solve. And I think that maybe this time next year, that's where we'll be. We'll have a whole bunch of new people thinking about the ways of solving problems that maybe is a little bit unexpected.
It makes me worry more about the quality of the data, but I do think that the technology will change people's behavior in interesting ways, and that's one of, you know, you talked about unexpected side effects, Ian, and I think that is one of them, is that people's behavior changes from quite small things, the way that they think about something, the way that they behave, and those things can have weird ripple effects and feedback loops and end up being quite seismic, and that might be one of the things that we are talking about next year, is how consumer behavior has changed, or how traveler behavior has changed.
Okay. Well, I think that's a good note to wrap up on. We've had an interesting conversation. I'm not sure it's been all that structured, but I hope there have been some nuggets of interest in there for our listeners. Next time around, we'll be back to focusing on the knitting. We'll be back to focusing on our core interests. But for now, I'd like to thank Amanda and Ian and Bert for joining me in this conversation. And I'd like to thank you for listening. And I look forward to talking to you again in the next issue of T2RL Talks.